This video is going to be looking at the cardiovascular system as a whole, specifically zooming in on the cardiac cycle and the conduction system. Okay, so the cardiovascular system is very important to the human body as it allows us to perform tasks in day-to-day life as well as keeping us healthy and permitting physical activity. So we're just going to look at the functions. So the first one is delivery. So this is delivery of nutrients such as oxygen and other nutrients like glucose to the muscles. And also hormones that need to be delivered around the body. Removal of waste products is the next one, so such as carbon dioxide and lactic acid. These are from different types of respiration, so carbon dioxide from aerobic respiration and lactic acid from anaerobic respiration during exercise, obviously. And also the removal of heat, because about 2/3 is lost as heat. So the next one is transport of oxygen. So oxygen binds to hemoglobin in the blood cells and then is transported around the body. Protection. So white blood cells are very important as they protect us from infection. They destroy microorganisms. And then the next one is thermoregulation. So this includes maintaining the body's core temperature. This is done by arterioles, which are blood vessels, and they allow vasodilation, which is when more heat can be carried to the skin and lost, and also vasoconstriction, which is when heat loss is prevented. So the final function is clotting. So platelets in the blood clot and they form scabs, which prevents the loss of blood. The heart is structured as a double pump as it has two sides that pump blood to different locations. The different circulatory systems are called pulmonary and systemic circuits. So as we can see in the image, the pulmonary system is all to do with the lungs. So deoxygenated blood is pumped out of the pulmonary trunk and travels along the pulmonary artery. This is until it reaches the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs, where gaseous exchange occurs and the blood becomes oxygenated. This oxygenated blood then travels through the pulmonary vein and back to the heart. On the other hand, the systemic system is used to transport blood around the rest of the body. So it starts when oxygenated blood is pumped out of the aorta and into the arteries. The blood is then moved into smaller arteries called arterioles just before reaching the muscles. These vessels perform vasodilation and vasoconstriction, which edits the amount of blood that is received by the muscles. So gaseous exchange happens at the systemic capillaries in the muscles. The blood is therefore received by these muscles and the oxygen in the blood is used, which means the blood becomes deoxygenated and travels back through the venules, which are like the vein equivalent of arterioles, so they're just very small vessels. After this, the blood transfers into veins and then enters the heart via the vena cava. So it's either the superior vena cava or the inferior, which depends on which part of the body the blood has come from. For example, if it's come from the leg, it's going to enter the inferior vena cava, or if it's come from the head, which is above the heart, obviously, it will come into the superior vena cava. So the heart is composed of a few layers which are all structured differently due to the different functions that they carry. So as we can see in the image, there's the different sections and they're clearly very different in the way that they are structured. So firstly, the endocardium, which is the thin inner layer that lines the heart chambers as well as covering the valves, protecting them. It's got a very simple job really. So next there's the outer protective sac known as the pericardium, which is made up of two layers. We've got the inner layer or the visceral layer and the outer layer, which is called the periantal pericardium. So the inner layer is also known as the epicardium, but the overall function of the pericardium is to give protection against infection and also provides lubrication for the heart. So the myocardium is the middle layer of the heart wall and is the thickest. This is due to it being composed of cardiac muscle fibres which enable heart contractions. So the myocardium is thickest in the left ventricle as this is responsible for generating enough power to pump oxygenated blood from the heart around to the rest of the body. So the heart is composed of many different components which all have differing structures and functions. So as we can see in the image, there's loads of different components of the heart all labelled. So the atria are the top two heart chambers that receive and hold blood and then pass it down to the ventricles. Therefore, they don't have thick walls, they have very thin walls, as we can see in the image. This is because they don't really have to deal with a high pressure. On the other hand, the left and right ventricles are the bottom two heart chambers and have very thick walls, as you can see in the picture. This is because their function requires them to contract and eject blood. Now, in the image, you may have noticed that the left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right ventricle, and this is because it has to eject blood more forcefully, which will allow the blood to reach the different body parts it has to go to, whereas the right ventricle only has to pump blood to the lungs, which are quite nearby. Now, the bicuspid valve is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and it's just two little flaps. The tricuspid valve is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it's three little flaps. The pulmonary valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve is seen between the left ventricle and the aorta. All these valves prevent backflow, and they do this by only being able to open one way, obviously then fulfilling their role. Now, the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles are what only allow valves to open one way. So the chordae tendineae are what actually prevent it from doing this, and the papillary muscles are what attach the tendons, or the chordae tendineae, to the walls of the ventricles. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the cardiac cycle. So a cardiac cycle is essentially one heartbeat. So this means that the heart is going through these two phases. So firstly, there's the systole phase, which means contraction essentially, and this takes 0.3 seconds. Then this is followed by the diastole phase, also known as the relaxation or the filling of the heart chambers, and this takes about 0.5 seconds. So as we can see in the image, the first picture shows the contraction or systole phase, blood being pumped out, and then the second image shows the relaxation or the blood filling the ventricles. Now, obviously, overall, one cardiac cycle takes roughly 0.8 seconds. The conduction system is composed of several components within the heart. So as we can see in the image, we've got the atrium and the ventricles labelled, as we've just discussed in a few slides back. So firstly, there's the SA node or the sinoatrial node, which is also known as the heart's pacemaker, as it initiates the heartbeat. It's located at the top of the right atrium, as we can see. The next node is the AV node or the atrioventricular node. This is found in the septum, which is the section that divides the two sides of the heart, just above the ventricles, and it receives the impulses from the SA node. The bundle of His is formed from a group of heart muscle cells and transmits impulses from the AV node to the ventricles. Bundle branches are simply just a series of branches that receive impulses from the bundle of His and continue them along to the Purkinje fibres. Now finally, the Purkinje fibres are found in the myocardium, which is the thickest middle section of the heart wall, and it allows the contraction of ventricles once the impulse has been received, so they contract from bottom all the way up the side to the top where the fibres end. Okay, so as we know, diastole is the relaxation or filling phase. So atrial diastole is just the process by which blood is entering the heart and filling the atria. So the pressure in the atria begins to rise as more blood fills. So the bicuspid valve in the left atrium and the tricuspid valve in the right atrium are forced open. So as a result of this, 70% of the blood moves from the atria to the ventricles, which is a process called ventricular diastole. Now, the remaining 30% is moved by atrial systole, which is simply the contraction of the atria. So this happens when an impulse is sent from the SA node, which happens without an external stimuli, which is known as myogenic, down to the AV node, pushing the remaining blood into the ventricles. Once this happens, the valves can shut. So now the blood needs to be pumped out of the heart. So this is done by a process of ventricular systole. So the impulse now continues from top to bottom, down from the AV node to the bundle of His in the septum and into the bundle branches, followed by moving up either side of the heart via the Purkinje fibres. So this forces the blood to open the pulmonary valve in the right atrium and the aortic valve in the left atrium and move out of the heart. The oxygenated blood then leaves via the aorta and heads to the muscles, whereas the deoxygenated blood leaves via the pulmonary trunk and goes to the lungs. Once the blood returns to the heart, the whole process can happen again. So as we've just seen in these images, we've got the 4 stages just there. So the cardiac cycle is influenced by the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system, which has 2 divisions, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So the cardiac control center, which is found in the medulla oblongata, along with all the other control centers, either sends a sympathetic nerve or a parasympathetic nerve. If the impulse is of the sympathetic type, then it is specifically called the accelerator nerve, which will trigger the release of norepinephrine, resulting in an elevated heart rate, and it also increases the strength of ventricular and atrial contractions. On the other hand, the PNS nerve is called the vagus nerve, which triggers the release of ACH, or acetylcholine, slowing down heart rate. Heart rate is also regulated by hormone control. So during or even before exercise, the SNS nerve triggers the release of adrenaline into the blood from the adrenaline glands. This acts directly on the SA node, increasing the heart rate and stroke volume, and therefore increasing the cardiac output. The blood has a few components that all have individual functions. First, there is plasma, which is a straw-coloured liquid made primarily of water that makes up roughly 55% of the blood. The main function of the plasma is to carry solid constituents such as red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. These are also all known as formed elements. So yeah, it acts as a transport mechanism. Next, there's the red blood cells, which make up about 45% of the blood, and they're also called erythrocytes. These are produced in red bone marrow and contain hemoglobin. Now, it's the iron in the hemoglobin that carries the oxygen, which is the main function of the red blood cells. So they're very efficient at what they do due to their bioconcave shape and the lack of nucleus, which allows more room for an uptake of oxygen. Another component found in the blood are the white blood cells. Now, these are also called lymphocytes, and they're roughly 3 times the size of red blood cells. The key function of the white blood cells are to fight infection by dealing with all disease and damage to our body. So, as well as white blood cells, platelets make up less than 1% of the blood and are also formed in bone marrow. Platelets work with fibrinogen, which is a protein, and they make blood clot. So this reduces the loss of blood and creates scabs. In the body, there are 5 different blood vessels that help the transport